Emily was just doing her job. It was a busy night at Lux Lounge, the rooftop bar buzzing with laughter and clinking glasses. Emily balanced a tray of drinks, weaving through the crowd. She didn't notice the group of loud guys until it was too late. One of them, a tall man with slicked back hair, bumped into her on purpose. The tray slipped from her hands, crashing to the floor. Before she could steady herself, he shoved her again. And then, splash, Emily fell backward into the pool. Cold water swallowed her whole. When she surfaced, gasping for air, the world seemed to freeze for a second. Then came the laughter. Loud, cruel, unrelenting. Phones flashed as people recorded the moment. Her cheeks burned. Her uniform clung to her skin. All she wanted was to disappear. But then, something changed. A man stepped forward. The man didn't say a word at first. He just stood there, his sharp suit and confident posture making him stand out from the crowd. The laughter around him began to fade, replaced by an uneasy silence. He turned to the guy who had pushed Emily, the one with slicked back hair, and stared him down. "Is this how you get your kicks?" the man asked, his voice calm but icy. The guy smirked, clearly not used to being challenged. "What's it to you, old man? She's just a waitress." The stranger's eyes narrowed. "Just a waitress?" he repeated, his tone sharper now. "You think that makes her less worthy of respect?" Before the guy could respond, the stranger reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick wad of cash. He tossed it onto the table where the group was sitting. "Here's your entertainment for the night," he said coldly. "Now leave." The group hesitated, glancing at each other nervously. They weren't used to being spoken to like this. After a moment, they grabbed their things and left, muttering under their breath. Once they were gone, the stranger turned to Emily. His expression softened as he held out a hand to help her out of the pool. "Are you okay?" he asked. Emily hesitated, unsure what to say. Finally, she nodded and took his hand. As he helped her up, she noticed the weight of his presence, the kind of person who commanded respect without even trying. "I'm Alexander Hartwell," he said simply, handing her a towel someone had brought over. "Emily," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander studied her for a moment, then pulled a business card from his jacket pocket. "If you ever need anything at all, you call me." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Emily standing there, dripping wet and confused. For days, Emily couldn't stop thinking about what happened that night. Alexander Hartwell's business card sat on her kitchen counter, untouched. She'd picked it up a dozen times, but always put it back down. What could someone like him possibly want with her? Still, something inside her wouldn't let her forget. Maybe it was the way he'd looked at her, not with pity, but with respect. Or maybe it was the quiet confidence in his voice when he told those bullies to leave. Whatever it was, she decided to take a chance. One evening after her shift at Joe's Diner, she pulled out her phone and dialed the number on the card. Her heart raced as the phone rang. "Alexander Hartwell," came the crisp reply on the other end. "Mr. Hartwell?" Emily stammered. "It's Emily Carter, from Lux Lounge." There was a pause. Then, Emily, I wondered if you'd call. How can I help you?" She hesitated. "I'm not sure. You said to call if I needed anything." "Good," he interrupted. "Meet me tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. I'll text you the address." Before she could ask more, he hung up. The next morning, Emily found herself standing outside a sleek office building in Midtown Manhattan. She felt out of place in her worn jeans and hoodie, surrounded by people in suits. But when she stepped inside, Alexander greeted her warmly. "I know your story, Emily," he said as they sat down in his office. "You work 2 jobs, you're chasing a dream, and yet you still manage to smile through it all. That takes strength." Emily blinked, surprised. No one had ever said anything like that to her before. "I want to give you an opportunity," Alexander continued. "One of my restaurants is hosting a special event next month. A showcase for up-and-coming chefs. I'd like you to prepare a dish." Her stomach dropped. "Me? But I'm just a waitress." "You're more than that," he said firmly. And I believe in second chances. This is yours. Emily left Alexander's office feeling like she was floating, but as soon as she stepped outside, reality hit her hard. What had she gotten herself into? She wasn't a chef, not really. Sure, she dreamed about it for years, but dreams didn't pay bills or impress critics. That night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. If she failed, it wouldn't just be embarrassing. It could ruin any chance of ever pursuing her dream again. But if she succeeded, the next morning Emily started early. She went to the library and borrowed cookbooks, jotting down ideas in a worn notebook. Then she headed to the grocery store with what little money she had left after paying rent. Back in her tiny apartment, she tied her hair back, rolled up her sleeves, and got to work. For weeks, Emily lived and breathed cooking. Her small kitchen became a battlefield of spices, sauces, and half-finished dishes. Some nights, she burned everything and cried out of frustration. Other nights, she tasted something so good it made her heart race with hope. Her best friend, Maria, stopped by one evening to check on her. "You're gonna kill it, Maria said, leaning against the counter while Emily plated a practice dish. "But what if I don't?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "What if I mess this up and embarrass myself? And Mr. Hartwell?" Maria shook her head. "Listen to me. You've worked harder than anyone I know. If anyone deserves this shot, it's you." Those words stuck with Emily. They kept her going when exhaustion threatened to pull her under. Finally, the day of the showcase arrived. The restaurant was buzzing with energy. Critics, food bloggers, and influencers filled the room, their phones ready to capture every bite. Emily stood behind the kitchen doors, her hands shaking as she adjusted her apron. "You've got this," whispered Chef Ramirez, the head chef who'd agreed to mentor her for the event. He gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze before stepping aside. When the doors swung open, Emily took a deep breath and walked out, carrying her dish. A beautifully plated roasted chicken with a citrus glaze, served over creamy polenta and garnished with fresh herbs. It was simple but elegant, a reflection of everything she'd learned growing up watching her grandmother cook. As she placed the plate in front of the judges, she forced herself to smile. "This is for anyone who's ever been told they're just anything," she said softly. The room fell silent as the judges took their first bites. The silence in the room felt like it stretched for hours, though it was only seconds. Emily stood frozen, her hands clasped tightly together as she watched the judges chew slowly, their faces unreadable. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. Finally, one of the critics, a well-known food writer with a reputation for being brutally honest, set down his fork and looked up at her. "This," he said, pointing to the dish, "is extraordinary." Emily blinked, unsure she'd heard him right. Another judge nodded enthusiastically. "The flavors are bold yet balanced. The citrus cuts through the richness of the chicken perfectly, and the polenta, it's heavenly." A murmur of agreement spread through the room. Cameras flashed, capturing Emily's stunned expression as the crowd erupted into applause. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't try to hide them. For the first time in years, she let herself feel proud. Alexander Hartwell stepped forward from the back of the room, a satisfied smile on his face. He raised a glass, drawing everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you to Emily Carter, the next big name in New York City's culinary scene." The applause grew louder, and Emily felt like she might collapse under the weight of it all. But then she noticed something else happening. Some of the people who had laughed at her that night at Lux Lounge were now clapping too, their smirks replaced with looks of guilt, or maybe admiration. Later that evening, Alexander pulled Emily aside. "You did it," he said simply, handing her another card. This one had an address written on it. "What's this?" she asked, glancing at the paper. "It's yours," he replied. "A restaurant space downtown. Consider it my investment in your future." Emily stared at him, speechless. "But why? Why would you do this for me?" "Because kindness matters," Alexander said firmly. "And because sometimes we need someone to believe in us before we can believe in ourselves." Months later, Emily stood in the kitchen of her very own restaurant, Carter's Table. It wasn't fancy or over the top. It was warm, inviting, and filled with the smells of home-cooked meals. Every dish told a story just like hers. On opening night, Maria hugged her tightly. "I'm so proud of you, Em. You've come so far. I couldn't have done it without help," Emily admitted, glancing toward Alexander, who sat at a corner table sipping coffee. As the night went on, Emily found herself reflecting on everything that had brought her here. The humiliation, the hard work, the unexpected kindness. It all led to this moment. And somewhere deep inside, she knew life had a way of balancing itself out. Those who mocked her had faded into the background, while those who showed compassion had changed her life forever. So, where are you from? No matter the answer, remember this. Kindness ripples outward, touching lives in ways we may never fully understand. And sometimes, doing the right thing doesn't just change someone else's world, it changes yours too. A year had passed since the opening night of Carter's Table. Emily's restaurant had become a staple in the neighborhood, known not just for its delicious food but also for its mission, to give back to the community. Every month, Emily hosted free cooking classes for kids from low-income families, teaching them skills she wished someone had taught her when she was younger. One crisp autumn evening, as golden leaves swirled outside the restaurant's windows, Emily looked around at the bustling dining room. Families laughed over shared plates, couples celebrated milestones, and strangers struck up conversations at communal tables. It was everything she'd ever dreamed of, and more. Her eyes landed on a familiar figure walking through the door, Alexander Hartwell. He smiled warmly as he approached her. "Looks like you're doing just fine without me," he said with a chuckle. Emily grinned. "I wouldn't be here without you." Alexander shook his head. "You were always meant for this, Emily. I just gave you a nudge." As they stood there talking, Emily noticed a young waitress clearing tables nearby. She moved with quiet determination, her smile never faltering despite the chaos around her. Something about her reminded Emily of herself not so long ago. Later that night, Emily pulled the waitress aside. "What's your name?" she asked gently. "Sophia," the girl replied, looking surprised. "Well, Sophia, if you ever need anything at all, you let me know. Everyone deserves a second chance." The girl's eyes widened, and for a moment, Emily saw the same flicker of hope she once felt. Kindness, Emily realized, wasn't just something you received. It was something you passed on. And sometimes, the smallest act of compassion could set off a ripple effect that changed lives far beyond your own.